Mop the floor well? She stood in the grand foyer of a sprawling estate that gleamed with marble and quiet pride, clutching a glass of aged bourbon in one hand. Her eyes, cold and sharp, locked onto the woman just behind her, her late father's new wife. The guests smiled politely, unaware that what they were witnessing was no courtesy, but a verdict. "From now on," she said, voice both measured and cutting, "you will serve this family as its maid. You will scrub these floors, lay out their meals, earn your keep." The woman's shoulders sagged, but she held back tears. Isabella, once a grieving child, had now orchestrated the ultimate humiliation, treating the only woman who tried to love her with calculated cruelty. Yet neither understood how deeply the consequences would cut, because the truth, when it finally broke through those elegant walls, would shatter everything Isabella believed she owned, and what followed would force everyone to question the meaning of family, loyalty, and justice. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. Why would a daughter turn her stepmother into a maid? What pain was buried so deep in Isabella's heart that it hardened into cruelty? To understand her choices, we must first go back to the beginning, to a childhood overshadowed by loss, to a father whose sudden death left more than grief behind, and to a woman named Grace who stepped into a role no one expected. But as Isabella stood in her wedding gown, arm in arm with a billionaire husband who promised her the world, questions lingered in the shadows. Was her cruelty born out of revenge? Was it fueled by old wounds that never healed? Or was it pride, the dangerous kind that blinds even the most powerful? And what of Grace? Reduced to scrubbing floors in silence, what secret did she carry? What truth did she know that would soon turn Isabella's triumph into her greatest downfall? Because what unfolded next was not merely about wealth or inheritance. It was about betrayal that cut deeper than blood, loyalty tested in ways no one could predict, and a twist so devastating that no amount of money or status could shield Isabella from its consequences. Isabella's story began not in the halls of luxury but in the shadow of tragedy. She was only 12 when her mother was killed in a sudden car crash on a rain-slick highway. One moment, the woman who tucked her in at night, who kissed her forehead before school, was there. The next, she was gone. The weight of that loss carved a wound in Isabella's heart that never fully closed. Her father, Chief Adrian, a man of influence and quiet strength, tried to hold their world together. But grief is heavy, and even he could not carry it alone. Within a year, Adrian remarried a woman named Grace. Grace was gentle, soft-spoken, and eager to build a bond with the child who had lost so much. She cooked Isabella's favorite meals, sat through her silences, and left handwritten notes by her schoolbooks, hoping one day they might be read with warmth. But where Grace offered kindness, Isabella returned only coldness. To her, Grace was not a helper, not a friend, she was an intruder, a woman daring to stand where her mother once stood. Isabella would watch her father laugh at the dinner table with Grace, and the sight only deepened the bitterness that took root in her soul. When Grace touched her shoulder, Isabella would recoil. When Grace offered to braid her hair, Isabella would pull away. And once, in a moment of raw, unguarded anger, Isabella whispered words that would echo through the years. "You'll never belong here." The rejection was sharp, final, and it broke something in Grace. Yet she did not lash back. She remained patient, believing time could soften the young girl's heart. But time only sharpened Isabella's resentment. Even as she grew older, her beauty admired, her future seemingly endless. The shadow of Grace in her household was a constant thorn. Friends saw only a fractured family trying to heal, but behind closed doors, silence turned into distance and distance into disdain. Grace continued to serve, not as a maid, but as a wife trying to be a mother to a child who refused her love. But Isabella's resentment would not end in silence. It would grow with her, fermenting beneath every smile, every polite word, every hollow attempt at peace. And one day, she would find the moment to finally take her revenge. Years passed, and Isabella grew into a woman admired for her striking beauty and undeniable charm. To the outside world, she was the daughter of the late Chief Adrian, destined to inherit power and privilege. But Isabella wanted more. She found it when she met Richard Obasi, a young billionaire whose fortune was matched only by his ambition. Their wedding was a spectacle that filled headlines, a union celebrated with glittering lights, designer gowns, and a guest list that stretched across continents. On that day, Isabella felt she had finally claimed the life she deserved, a life of wealth, admiration, and influence. But for Grace, who watched quietly from the crowd, the marriage marked the beginning of something darker. Not long after the wedding, Isabella made a decision that stunned those who knew her. She invited Grace into her new Lagos mansion, not as family, not as a stepmother, but as a servant. Grace was given a small room in the servants' quarters at the back of the estate, a stark contrast to the lavish suites that glittered with chandeliers and velvet drapes. Isabella ordered her to clean floors polished enough to reflect her face, to wash the designer gowns that hung in endless rows, and to serve meals at grand parties where the elite gathered. For Grace, every task was not simply work. It was humiliation delivered by the very child she had once tried to love. The cruelty grew sharper with each passing day. Isabella began making Grace serve her closest friends at afternoon teas, forcing her to refill champagne glasses while guests whispered in confusion. At dinner, when leftovers remained, Isabella insisted Grace eat them alone in the kitchen, as if she were nothing more than hired help. What cut deepest was the public ridicule. At a glittering cocktail party filled with Lagos's most powerful names, a guest leaned in and whispered, "Isn't that the late chief's wife?" The room fell into a hush, eyes turning toward Grace, who stood in the corner carrying a tray of hors d'oeuvres. Isabella smirked, lifted her glass, and with a chilling calmness replied, "She used to be. Now she's just my help." Laughter rippled through the crowd, shallow and nervous, as Grace lowered her eyes and swallowed the sting of her pride. She did not argue. She did not fight. She endured. Every night she folded herself into silence, retreating to her small quarters while the sounds of music, wealth, and laughter echoed from the mansion above. Grace bore the weight of humiliation without protest, her dignity chipped away in fragments. But what Isabella never realized was that humiliation, when pushed too far, always carries a cost. And that cost was already waiting at her door. It did not take long for Isabella's cruel choices to leave cracks in the perfect world she had built. Behind the polished marble walls of the Obasi mansion, the tension began to grow. Richard Obasi, once blinded by Isabella's beauty and the allure of their power couple image, could not ignore what he was beginning to witness. At first, he dismissed the whispers, the rumors carried through Lagos social circles about how his wife treated her stepmother. But one evening, as he returned from a late meeting, he saw it with his own eyes. Grace was on her knees, scrubbing the floor with trembling hands, while Isabella stood above her, issuing commands as if she were addressing nothing more than a servant. Richard's face tightened with unease. In his world of billion-dollar negotiations and boardroom rivalries, cruelty had no place. But in his own home, it had become routine. Word began to spread quietly among Lagos's elite. At galas and dinners, hushed voices carried the same question: how could a billionaire's wife, admired in the public eye, reduce her own stepmother to a life of humiliation? The gossip was relentless, and though Isabella tried to mask it with charm and extravagance, cracks began to show in her composure. The pressure of constant scrutiny, the whispers of betrayal, and the watchful eyes of her husband left her unraveling in silence. Then, one morning, the household was thrown into chaos. Grace collapsed while polishing the marble staircase. Her body, weary from endless work and silent suffering, could take no more. Servants rushed forward, panic flooding the mansion. An ambulance was called, its sirens cutting through the air as neighbors gathered at the gates. The image was impossible to ignore. Grace, frail and unconscious, carried out of the home of the woman who had once been her daughter. In the streets, the whispers grew louder. How could she? People asked. How could Isabella Obasi, with all her wealth, treat her stepmother this way? The scandal drew the attention of the media. Among them was a persistent journalist, a man who had built a reputation for uncovering truths buried beneath wealth and power. He began digging into Isabella's family history, piecing together fragments of a story that had been forgotten, or perhaps deliberately hidden. He uncovered testimonies from those who had known Chief Adrian in his final years, stories that painted a far different picture of Grace than the one Isabella had clung to all her life. Grace was not the opportunist Isabella believed her to be. She was a woman who had once saved Chief Adrian's life, pulling him from the wreckage of a car accident years before fate would take him in another. She had stood by him in hospital corridors, cared for him when no one else would, and eventually became the woman he trusted enough to marry. But Isabella never knew. To her, Grace had been nothing more than an intruder, a thief who had stolen the place of her late mother. And now, as these old wounds resurfaced, the narrative that Isabella had built for herself began to collapse. She was no longer the glamorous billionaire's wife admired for her poise and power. She was the subject of scandal, whispered about in boardrooms, written about in newspapers, judged by a public that demanded answers. And when the truth finally came out, it was something Isabella could never have prepared for. The investigation reached its breaking point when Grace, weary of being painted as an intruder in Isabella's life, finally revealed a truth she had carried in silence for years. Chief Adrian, Isabella's late father, had not left his entire fortune to his daughter alone. In his final will, he had set aside a portion of his estate for Grace. It was not a token or a gesture of convenience. It was deliberate, written in his own hand. To him, Grace had not been a replacement for Isabella's mother, but a companion who had brought him peace in the darkest years of his life. The revelation shook Richard Obasi to the core. It was not just the fact that Grace had been left something, it was what followed that horrified him. Hidden in legal files and court archives, Richard discovered that Isabella had fought viciously to erase this truth. She had contested the will, petitioned the courts, and worked to strip Grace of everything her father had intended for her. For years, Isabella had ensured that Grace remained voiceless not just in her home, but in the eyes of the law. Soon, the battle resurfaced, this time under the scrutiny of a public hungry for scandal. In courtrooms filled with reporters and flashing cameras, lawyers clashed over the documents Chief Adrian had left behind. The air was thick with tension as handwritten words from the late chief were presented to the judge. Grace gave me peace when I had none. She deserves respect, not rejection. The words cut through the silence like a knife. For the first time, the world heard Chief Adrian's voice beyond the grave, not in speeches or business deals, but in the intimate confession of a man who had loved and trusted his wife. Isabella sat frozen. The mask of composure she wore in public began to crack. Behind her diamond jewelry and flawless gowns, her face betrayed the truth, the fear of exposure, the dread of losing not just her reputation but the narrative she had controlled for so long. Whispers filled the courtroom as eyes turned toward her. Some looked with pity, others with anger. Richard, seated beside her, did not speak, but the look in his eyes said what words could not: disappointment, betrayal, and a dawning realization that the woman he had married was not the woman he thought she was. And as the verdict loomed, Isabella clung to the only weapon she had left: her silence. But just when she thought she could silence the past, karma struck harder than she ever expected. The gavel struck and the court fell silent. Grace had won, not just in the eyes of the law but in the hearts of the people. What began as whispers in Lagos social circles had now become a roar of public sympathy. Newspapers carried headlines: "Stepmother humiliated, but justice prevails." Commentators spoke of resilience, of dignity, of a woman who had endured shame yet walked out of court with her head held high. For Isabella, the world she built on pride began to collapse quietly, piece by piece. Richard Obasi, once her shield and admirer, no longer stood by her side. He did not issue a public statement, nor did he confront her in anger. Instead, his absence said it all. At parties where the Obasis once arrived hand in hand, Isabella now entered alone. The same guests who once marveled at her beauty and envied her wealth whispered behind jeweled fans and champagne glasses. "That's the woman who turned her stepmother into a maid," they murmured, and in those words lay the stain she could never wash away. The mansion that once echoed with laughter and admiration grew colder by the day. Servants avoided her gaze. Friends stopped calling. Even in rooms filled with gold and crystal, Isabella felt the weight of silence pressing down on her. One night, standing before a gilded mirror in her bedroom, Isabella hardly recognized the reflection staring back. Her makeup smeared from tears, her diamond necklace hanging heavy but meaningless. The image of power was gone. All that remained was a woman consumed by bitterness and utterly alone. And then came the final blow. Grace, the very woman Isabella had humiliated, refused revenge. She did not gloat. She did not raise her voice. When approached by journalists and neighbors, Grace simply said, "I forgive her, not because she deserves it, but because I refuse to let hate own me." Her words spread further than Isabella could have imagined. In Grace's forgiveness, people saw strength. In Isabella's downfall, they saw a warning. But forgiveness was not freedom. For Isabella, it was a reminder that her cruelty had cost her more than she ever gained. She still had her fortune, her mansion, her jewels, yet she had no family, no husband, no peace. In the end, Isabella had everything money could buy, except the one thing her mother left behind: love. And perhaps that was the true punishment all along. So what do you think? Did Isabella truly deserve her downfall? Or was she simply a broken child who never healed from the grief of losing her mother in that tragic car crash? Was her cruelty toward Grace a reflection of evil, or a desperate cry for love that was never answered? Tell us in the comments below, because this story is more than just about wealth and betrayal. It's about family, forgiveness, and the dangerous cost of letting resentment rule your heart. And if you thought Isabella's downfall was shocking, wait until you hear what happened when a millionaire left his safe open to test his maid. What she did next will leave you absolutely breathless. Subscribe now, because you don't want to miss it.